A new special envoy to the Horn of Africa. A veteran U.S. diplomat begins official visits to Sudan and Ethiopia, with U.S. influence waning in the region. Is Washington looking to boost its role while curbing China's? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is David Satterfield. U.S. President Joe Biden's newly appointed Horn of Africa envoy is getting straight to work with a three-stop trip to the region. After a meeting in Saudi Arabia, David Satterfield will visit Sudan and Ethiopia, aiming to help mediate peace in a conflict-torn part of the world. In Riyadh, Ambassador Satterfield will hold talks with Friends of Sudan, a group calling for the restoration of their transitional government following October's military coup. Then, a meeting in Khartoum to help facilitate a renewed civilian-led transition to democracy. Finally, Satterfield moves on to Addis Ababa to meet Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, seeking a resolution to the deepening civil war. Now, here's what the State Department says U.S. diplomats will be trying to achieve.
They will encourage government officials to seize the current opening for peace by ending the airstrikes and other hostilities, negotiating ceasefire, releasing all political prisoners, restoring sustained humanitarian access, and laying the foundation for an inclusive national dialogue.
Let's take a quick look now at the career of the new appointee. Secretary of State Antony Blinken assigned Satterfield special envoy to the Horn of Africa on January 6th, replacing Jeffrey Feltman, who'd resigned just days after Sudan's prime minister stepped down. Now, Satterfield has a long history of assignments in some of the world's most diplomatically complicated regions. From 1998 to 2001, Satterfield was ambassador to Lebanon. He was then appointed Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs in 2004. Satterfield served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad between 2005 and 2006. He then became Senior Advisor to the Secretary of State and Coordinator for Iraq in 2006. In addition to his experience in the Persian Gulf, Lebanon, and Iraq, he most recently served as ambassador to Turkey. Well, of course, the Horn of Africa has no shortage of challenges. Somalia has seen decades of instability and violence. The government struggles to provide basic services as Somali and African Union forces battle al-Shabaab with U.S. air support. Somalia's president has personal ties with the U.S., having sought asylum, studied, and worked in New York for many years. Meanwhile, the self-proclaimed autonomous region of Somaliland is seeking U.S. recognition in return for strengthening ties with Taiwan. Djibouti is among the smallest countries on the continent, but it's arguably the most stable in the Horn of Africa. Both the U.S. and China have military bases there. As part of the Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing has poured billions of dollars into developing the port where the Red Sea meets the Indian Ocean. Ethiopia has been mired in civil war for more than a year now. Nobel Prize-winning Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is leading government forces in the fight against rebels from the northern Tigray region. Human rights groups say both sides have committed atrocities. Eritrea to the north is also accused by Tigrayan forces of sending troops to attack them in Ethiopia. The country is often called the North Korea of Africa for its authoritarian regime led by President Isaias Afwerki. The Chinese foreign minister condemned U.S. sanctions on Eritrea during his recent visit to the country, which is strategically important for China's efforts to expand trade. And finally, Sudan and its shaky transition to democracy after years of one-man rule under Omar al-Bashir. A military coup last year brought General al-Burhan to power, and civilian leader Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok resigned 2 weeks ago in response to protests against a power-sharing agreement. U.S. analysts are often critical of what they describe as U.S. disengagement from the country. Well, with so many urgent issues, this appointment matters. The U.S. announced Satterfield's new role on the same day China said it was appointing a special envoy to foster peace in the region. Now, Beijing has been playing an increasingly active role in the Horn of Africa, and for the first time has offered to mediate an end to the war in Ethiopia. Beijing has traditionally been more focused on economic development and trade in Africa over politics and diplomacy. China's foreign minister paid what's become a traditional New Year's visit to the continent, aiming to set the pace for future cooperation on the Belt and Road Initiative. But does appointing a special envoy signal that China wants to play a bigger diplomatic role in the Horn of Africa, despite potential confrontation with the United States? And that's what many are asking now as David Satterfield sets off on his first mission. And joining me to help answer that and more is Cameron Hudson in Washington, D.C. He was the chief of staff to the former U.S. envoy to Sudan. He's now a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. Gabriel Negatu also joins us from the U.S. Capitol. He was the Eastern Africa director of the African Development Bank. Last week, he published an essay titled "The U.S. Risks Losing Its Influence in the Horn of Africa. Here's How to Get It Back." And in Nairobi, we have Kholood Khair. She's a managing partner of Khartoum-based Insight Strategy Partners, and she hosts a political discussion show on Sudanese radio. Thanks all so much for being with us. Let's first establish what each of you makes of Satterfield's appointment and its timing. He's a big diplomatic hitter, often assigned to posts with a lot at stake. So what does it say, actually, about U.S. policy in the Horn of Africa right now? Is it becoming more of a priority? Cameron, I'll start with you.
Well, I don't know if it's coming more of a priority than it has been. I would say that the appointment of Satterfield shows a consistency, at least from the Biden administration, to have no gap in coverage in this envoy role. I think when the first envoy for the Horn of Africa was appointed, Jeff Feltman, it was seen by many as Washington for the first time really recognizing the Horn of Africa as its own kind of strategic region with strategic interests and with a whole different set of outside actors, particularly from across the Red Sea in the Gulf, but also including Egypt, Turkey, and the like, a set of countries with a particular set of influences in that region, requiring diplomats not just who were based in Africa or who had experience coming from Africa, but really diplomats from the Near East Bureau of the State Department, who brought with them a Rolodex of contacts and influence makers across this Red Sea region. And so we've seen that with the appointment of Jeff Feltman, and now again with David Satterfield, people who come not from the Africa Bureau, but from the Near East Bureau. And I think you're seeing, therefore, a real pivot from Washington looking at this region, not through the eyes of the African Union and through African partners, but really now more through Gulf partners. And I think that's going to change the tone, it's going to change the tenor, and it's going to change the content of U.S. policy by being, in fact, influenced in many ways by Saudi Arabia, by the Emirates, and by Turkey.
Interesting. Cameron, very quickly, if you just kind of sum up what you think actually happened to Feltman and if Satterfield can do what he wasn't able.
Well, I think that Feltman, had come to hit the end of his time in office. Let's remember he had been retired and was looking, I think, to live a think tank life in Washington. Was called back into service in the early days of the administration at a moment of crisis in Ethiopia and in Sudan. So really as a stopgap measure. So I wouldn't read too much into the departure of Jeff Feltman, who from the very beginning made clear that he wasn't looking for a job in the administration. I think that what will be required for Satterfield to really succeed is to have sustained involvement at the highest levels. And I guess we have seen that already with his announcement. In the days since his announcement, we saw President Biden make his very first phone call to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, his first phone call to a Horn of Africa leader since taking office in the last year. So hopefully that's a sign of more high-level and sustained involvement to come from Washington.
Okay. Gabriel, let me ask you if you're in any way looking forward to this new appointment, to Satterfield taking over, Satterfield rather, and do you think it is key to the U.S., as you put it, getting its influence back in the region?
Yeah, thank you. Of course, yeah, we do look forward to and welcome Satterfield's appointment, but let's remember that it's not the change of personalities that's going to bring about the reform, the required reform. I would hope that Satterfield is a seasoned diplomat, having served in Turkey most recently a region that is critical to the U.S. and that his appointment signifies the importance that the U.S. gives to the Horn of Africa. If indeed, as Cameron said, he's coming with a view to see the Horn of Africa from a Middle East perspective, while Middle East is important to the Horn of Africa, but the Horn of Africa is also coming of age and has its own issues and wants them resolved in its own way and not be a footnote to the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East or somewhere else. And I hope this seasoned politician understands that this is not the same Horn or East Africa of 20 years ago or so, that countries are now asserting themselves and he should be prepared to engage as equal partners based on principles and values and not come with a long stick of sanctions and punitive measures that countries have now learned to generally, not ignore, but not pay too much attention.
Right. They've just learned to deal with it. Kholood, let me ask you, though, I have to bring up another issue here because it really hasn't been mentioned yet. I mean, how much, if at all, is this about China and, buffering its influence and investment in the Horn of Africa?
Sure. I mean, I think China is really important because, of course, with the sort of abrogation of a focus on the Horn of Africa during the Trump years, China found that a very sort of key access point to open up its engagement in the Horn of Africa, and it has done so with aplomb, because it wants to bring about this Belt and Road initiative and sort of take it from the Red Sea all the way to the Atlantic on the other side, crossing the Sahel. Those are one of the routes that they want to sort of cultivate, and doing that means having to go through these Horn of Africa countries. And China has, I think, cleverly played its role in the Horn of Africa. It has, for example, been very instrumental in the AU, in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of political support in Addis. It has these footholds in the Horn of Africa region that frankly the US hasn't had, and to what extent they're able to sort of make up for that now remains to be seen. But again, it's not about personalities; it's about how much of the political weight these personalities, these envoys, can be given, how well they play with others, particularly those with whom they share supposedly, political values, how much pressure they're able to put on key players, particularly recalcitrant players within some of these Horn of Africa countries. That will be the biggest decisive factor.
Right. Kholood, it does remain to be seen in many ways, but let me ask you if, the U.S. does pursue more of a policy of non-engagement, and basically stays out of the region for the most part, what would be the consequences for the U.S.?
We're already sort of seeing these consequences because arguably the US has played a hands-off approach, not just during the Trump years, but even now with Biden announcing that the US is back in terms of foreign policy and leadership on sort of democratic or liberal values. The proof really has yet to be seen. We're not really, or rather we haven't been, seeing enough of that, I think, to back up the rhetoric. And what that means is that we'll probably get more of the same, but in many ways, thinking particularly of the context of Sudan, which is quite fragile and is by no means stable, we will probably see more recalcitrant actors, the generals, the military in this case, feeling that they are more empowered, more emboldened to continue with their project. They don't see, for example, that the US is a party or an international figure that can play as much of a role as is required, and they're using that as an opportunity to push for sort of the consolidation of their own political projects.
Okay, Cameron, I want to ask you along the same lines there. And I mean, do you think the U.S. has had a bit of a wake-up call and its involvement in the region and really needing to play a more proactive role in diplomacy in the Horn of Africa?
Well, I think that wake-up call is coming. What I would say, however, is that Washington has been slow to recognize the political shifts going on in the Horn of Africa, both domestically within the countries themselves, but also with this new dynamic of international players taking an interest and playing a very decisive role in the politics of the region. And so I think that we have seen, at least in the last 2 years of kind of crisis in the Horn of Africa, whether it's been with Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, We've seen the Africans playing less and less of a role. We've seen the regional organization IGAD playing virtually no role, whereas 20 years ago, it would have perhaps been leading a political process that the UN is about to take over in Sudan. It might have been leading a process of political talks in Ethiopia to help resolve the Tigray crisis. And we have seen virtually nothing from that organization or from the African Union. However, we have seen a higher level of involvement, both politically, economically, and militarily, coming from the Gulf countries and seeing their influence really rise. And so, yes, there is a vacuum that Trump and the United States have created by stepping back, not just in the Horn of Africa, but I think globally from U.S. commitments. But I think the bigger trend that we haven't really investigated as a U.S. policy is how are all of these vacuums being filled by not just China but by the near actors in the region, and what does that mean for U.S. policy?
Right. Gabriel, I have to ask you more specifically about Ethiopia. Relations with Ethiopia are obviously key to managing this special envoy role for David Satterfield, but how difficult is that relationship at present, given what some actually see as U.S. support even for Tigrayan rebels rather than for the government in Addis?
Right. For quite some time, many of us believe that the U.S. foreign policy was misguided in terms of supporting the rebel movement in the attempt to overthrow the government. But it seemed like the balance of power shifted on the ground, and the Abiy government has now all but defeated the rebel movement and pushed them back into Tigray. There seems to be a rethink of the U.S. foreign policy, and the phone call by President Biden to Prime Minister Abiy, I think, speaks to that. And that, in that sense, the new ambassador will have his work cut out, but there still remains quite a bit of heavy lifting to be done in terms of negotiating and finding a lasting solution in the region. So that will be its biggest challenge. But the U.S. policy started rather misguided, but I think has now shifted back to the center and seems to be trying to help find a durable solution to the crisis.
You say there's quite a bit of heavy lifting to be done. I mean, how much is Addis really weighing the balance between China's interests in Ethiopia and what the U.S. would like to see?
Well, Addis, but Addis is not unique in this. Most African countries, as I've said, have come of age and do not want to be relegated to the Cold War policy of you're either with us or against us. They want to be able to maintain a healthy and robust relation with the U.S. as well as with China and Turkey and other partners. And Addis is doing just that. China has been a friend, a partner. China has been with Ethiopia since the 1950s. It has been supporting in various ways. The U.S. has been there much longer. But the challenge of Addis now is to weigh those two relations and keep a healthy balance between the two and not having to pick one over the other.
Right. It's interesting because Anthony Blinken spoke directly to that, saying we're not dictating to anyone that the United States doesn't want to limit your partnership with other countries. We want to make your partnerships with us even stronger, but we don't want to make you choose. We want to give you the choice. So it does go along the lines of what you're just describing. But let me move on to Kholood and something closer to Sudan in this particular visit. In Riyadh, Satterfield is going to be meeting with Friends of Sudan. It's a pro-democracy group, an organization that's calling for, obviously, the return of the transitional government. Do you think that was a good first stop to be made, to go into Saudi Arabia to meet with these what are now seen as dissidents by the military rulers in Sudan? Or does it more highlight what Cameron was saying about these Middle Eastern players becoming more influential in the Horn of Africa than ever before?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think the work of an envoy is going to work on several orders of magnitude. You have, sort of recognition of an engagement in the in-country dynamics, as well as then the dynamics between the envoy and other actors within, for example, the United States government, and then the relationship between the envoy and other governments. And I think it's quite clear that Saudi Arabia is playing a key role. Whether that role is a positive one or a negative one, I think is a subject of our whole show. But the point is that it is important for the US to engage with those actors, because actually that's where they have a lot more leverage, certainly more so than over domestic actors, particularly the civilians in country. What I think it really needs to be the key here is that he needs support within Sudan, for example, within Ethiopia, within the Horn of Africa countries, not just within the region. And that's a balance that previous envoys have found difficult to manage.
Right. Kholood, I have to ask you, I mean, this is a bigger themed question here, but how much so-called engagement do African leaders really want to see from the United States? Because there becomes a point where it suddenly is considered interference or meddling. It's welcome in some instances and not in others. I mean, can you have it both ways, or is there one strategic good way to do this?
No, there is no one good way to do this, because every context is different. And I think that sort of the value of an envoy is knowing when engagement is welcome and when it isn't. And quite frankly, what we've seen from several envoys is that there hasn't been this ability to read the context in that way. Certainly, if you look at Sudan, the most consequential political actors of the moment right now, for example, the resistance committees leading the pro-democracy movement, are pretty much left out of discussions at the higher level. And so there is this sort of blindness to a large proportion of the more politically consequential engagements and politics that is taking place in favor of what is more easily legible, the armed forces, key political elites, etc. And that is not a trend that should be continued, frankly.
Cameron, I can see you agree there.
Well, yeah, I think that what Kholood is getting at is that there is a gap that exists between the kind of rhetoric that you hear from President Biden and Tony Blinken, who speak very glowingly of democracy and human rights. And then you have people like David Satterfield, who are on the front line of these diplomatic encounters, who have to figure out a way to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And so how do we have a kind of aspirational foreign policy that tries to advance democracy and human rights on the ground? And then how do we operationalize that in a way that is both consistent with the wishes of the people at the grassroots level? So in Sudan, where we're also trying to engage with military leaders and the like who are committing crimes against democracy and human rights. So I think it's we have to help bridge that gap between the rhetoric and the reality in our diplomacy.
Gabriel, just a few minutes left. I want to get your final thoughts on what you've just heard there.
Well, I agree with what they both said, and Cameron is right. It needs to be aspirational, but what we need to keep in mind is these aspirations must include the aspirations of the African side also. It cannot be the aspirations of the US in terms of what it wants to do, but it must reflect the aspiration of the Sudanese. And for example, Sudanese or any other country in Sudan, you've got one set of leaders from the military side, and you've got an entire mass movement that's grounded on the throughout the country, and that aspiration must also be reflected. Otherwise, the aspiration of Khartoum alone or Addis alone is not going to capture what is going to be workable foreign policy.
Kholood, I just want to ask you one final question on Sudan, because this transition to democracy, it will matter so much to the entire region if it happens or does not happen. How much do you feel the U.S. is genuinely respected right now in Sudan? I mean, because the generals genuinely just don't seem to care what the U.S. may or may not dangle in front of them as an incentive, a carrot or a stick, to do what the U.S. deems fit and better for the democratic evolvement of the country.
I mean, there are several parts to that question. The first is that to what extent can the U.S. make its position sort of felt and heard? And of course, without an ambassador in post, and that has been something that has been in the works for a long time, it's very difficult for the U.S. to get that traction in the first place. The second thing is that, there are no consequences to what the US says. There has been sort of a death by statements that we've seen from many in the international community, particularly those who espouse democratic values. And of course, with these statements, there is a law of diminishing returns. More statements does not equal more impact. So actually what we're seeing is that, other countries like the UAE, like Saudi Arabia, even some African countries, Russia, etc., for them, there is no legitimate, I think, or sort of real will to see any civilian transformation. The US is in a difficult position because it has said so. So it loses legitimacy every time it says that it espouses these democratic ideals and then is not able to back it up. That is the key consideration for the US.
Okay, Kholood Khair, Gabriel Negatu, and Cameron Hudson, I'd like to thank all three of you so much for being with us on this very insightful edition of the Newsmakers, and our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.